Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, James.
Thank you. I don't know where that sound came from, but thank you, Julia. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to our special guest, Dr. Becca Jablonski from Colorado State University, for getting here. Coming here. It's always, by the way, 70 and sunny degrees here in southern Indiana, but she got in yesterday, and we've had her sort of jam-packed through here. So I'm going to start off with a little introduction. Becca comes from Colorado State University's College of Agricultural Sciences, Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. She earned her BA in History from Cornell and an MS from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies and a PhD back at Cornell University. Dr. Jablonski's research focuses on understanding processes of rural and regional development with an emphasis on identifying strategies to support entrepreneurship, improve agribusiness performance, and enhance regional food systems. Specifically, her research centers on assessing the impacts of food system initiatives and strengthening that rural-urban linkage to farmers, supply chain participants, and rural regional economies. Dr. Jablonski is currently the chair of the Community and Regional Economics Network of the Applied Agricultural Economics Association. And interestingly, I found out this morning, she teaches a course on small ag business management, and she partners teams of students up with businesses in Colorado and operations outside of CSU to provide support to those operations to connect her research, her service extension, and teaching pedagogy. I think many of you would be interested in that approach. Our colloquium today is on her paper entitled Measuring the Stock of Wealth and its Association with Food Systems Efforts. Dr. Jablonski, you'll have about 5 minutes to recap the paper, and then we'll have open Q&A for 55 minutes or so, and I'll try to maintain order.
Okay, great.
Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm really happy to be here. So, actually, I don't think I've ever given a 5-minute talk before. So I had 2 versions of this talk. Version 1 was sort of recapping the paper, but I opted for version 2, which is to give you a little bit more of the backstory about why I'm interested in this topic or how I started putting this paper together, because I think it may give you a little bit more insight into the type of feedback that I would love to get from all of you. I think that hopefully this is an important topic, especially given the interdisciplinary nature of the workshop. And you can see, obviously, we're drawing from a lot of different disciplines here, though obviously more so in econ. So, when I wrote the future research section of my dissertation, I was able to turn it into a NIFA grant, through the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture with my mentor, Todd Schmidt at Cornell. So we wrote this grant that was focused on how you can evaluate the rural and especially farm and ranch profitability impacts of an urban food system initiative. So we thought, okay, this is great. And of course, we proposed this grand plan that the funders love, but that I now, in retrospect, realized was, kind of be my lifelong journey here of research and not a 3-year grant. So anyway, as part of this, we really wanted to understand how to actually quantify what some of the spillover impacts were essentially of this initiative that took place in this urban place. And so one of the approaches that we wanted to take was essentially taking a social accounting matrix, and for those of you in this room who are not familiar with social accounting matrices, essentially what they're doing is they're measuring all of the economic linkages within a particular region. So we're measuring both what industries need to purchase in order to produce outputs, and then also what all of the outputs are. And so we wanted to essentially take this approach to essentially build a comprehensive social accounting matrix or a comprehensive wealth accounting framework that had recently been developed mostly by Tom Johnson. I don't know if any of you know Tom. Tom's now emeritus. He was at Missouri for a lot of years. He had a bunch of different roles there. He's also been involved with RUPRI, which is the Rural Policy Research Institute. So he had proposed this theoretical framework for how to do this that's in this Rural Wealth Creation book. And we were actually going to do it using this case study and some of the data that we collected from this food systems initiative. So this is straight out of his book, right? This is what the framework is. And so this piece here, and I'm not going to go into the detail because I probably have like 3 minutes left, but this is what a traditional social accounting matrix looks like. What his innovation was to add in these changes in capital, right? And you can see, because in an input, output, or social accounting matrix framework, whatever you have that goes in has to also come out, right? They have to equal each other. So he proposed this nice, neat framework, but figuring out how to do it proved a lot more difficult than we had thought. And one of the main challenges here is that this measures flows, right? And I'm going to talk in a second about the difference between flows and stocks and why those matter. But when you're trying to measure a flow, the problem is you have to understand what the entire amount of stock is. So for example, we saw that there were changes in intellectual capital that took place through selling at a farmer's market. Farmers talk to stakeholders, right? They talk to people who are purchasing their product. They got new ideas for product development. To some extent, they actually took those ideas, they went back to their rural communities, and they started sharing those ideas with the neighbors. They built new processing facilities. But those ideas, right, that's a flow of information. Eventually, what you hope, especially someone who works in rural development, is that you take the flow of information and it actually becomes a stock, right? It's going to actually improve the wealth of that stock of capital that you have in a rural place. But figuring out, one, to the extent to which that flow translated into a stock proved very difficult, and then two, figuring out how do we actually understand the magnitude of that impact relative to what the entire stock is of the capital in that region. Does that make sense to everybody, what I'm trying to say? So just to kind of touch on this point about flows versus stocks and why this matters. So the idea here is that the stock, right, that's the wealth. That's what we actually can keep in the bathtub. And it's really ultimately that stock that you want to impact in a rural community, right, or in any community. But you want to make sure that you're essentially keeping as much of these different pieces of the investment within your economy here. So natural capital would be a good place to look as just an example. So say that we're increasing income through essentially clear-cutting forests, right? Well, that's going to give us some money in the short term, right? We're going to see an increase in the income. But the thing is, we've actually we've lost that natural capital, right? And so we've depleted the stock of natural capital at the same time that we've increased that flow, right? That income that's come in. So what we ultimately wanted to be able to measure was what that net amount is that's going to be those changes of wealth. And so you can see here why it was so important that we could understand what the magnitude is of that change in the flow. So thinking about how we can more comprehensively evaluate these stocks of capital is not new. This is something that's been talked about for a long time. So of course, William Nordhaus has been in the press a lot recently, right? Because he just won the Nobel Prize in economics. And so he was part of this panel that was convened in 2005 by national academies. And what they said is that we know that really thinking about how to measure what's in that wealth, right, that stays in the bathtub is really important. And we know that through only thinking about things like GDP, which is ultimately a flow, we're really missing out on understanding how policies or how investments are actually impacting what the stock is of that wealth in a place, and that's really important. And so they put together this very, very long report on recommendations on how to do this, and ultimately came up with the fact that the kind of best way to do it is through these satellite accounts. And the satellite accounts look very similar to what's proposed here, with basically adding in these different kinds of capitals into this social accounting matrix framework. And part of what they said is that we don't want to scrap the system of how we do national accounts right now. This is well established. We do this in every country. It makes it comparable across regions, and all of that's really important. But we have to be able to integrate some of these other things that we know are important, right? And the place where Nordhaus has had the biggest contribution, of course, is in thinking about climate and environment, right? And if you go to a place like Britain, right, and we've got some other countries that do this, they have actually incorporated satellite accounts around natural capital specifically, right? But we're very limited, I think, across the world in the extent to which we've actually tried to think about how we effectively take these other components, these capitals that we know contribute to long-term sustainable development in communities and in regions, and actually integrate it in a meaningful way in how we evaluate and enact these rural policies. So as I said, there's a lot of literature here on how we conceptualize it. Where I'm at 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, wow. So that's why, I feel like I just jumped into a lot of meat, but that's okay. So basically, just to say this piece is actually in the paper now. So to figure out how we could define the stocks, which is really the main thing that I wanted to try to do in here in this paper, we did a comprehensive literature review. We did it as interdisciplinary as we possibly could. This isn't fully reflective of all of the different things that we looked at, but I think one of the things that's interesting, would be of interest to this group, is that we find that the disciplines don't speak to each other. So there's this literature by the Floras, for example, that's more in the sociology space, and then there's this rural wealth creation literature that's in the econ space. They don't even cite each other, right? That's the extent to which we're sort of talking across each other. And so what we really tried to do is think about, okay, what are all of the measures that have been used? And then think critically about how we actually discern those flows in the stocks. And that's not always easy to do, but we think that that's of critical importance. And if you look at that rural wealth creation paper that Tom Johnson piece, he talks about that a lot more. And so we tried to discern between these stocks and flows, and then think about what do we actually have data on over time. Because if we're going to actually try to throw out a measure that ideally we want people to actually take and start to use, we want something that is available to people, right? That it doesn't just always rely on going and collecting information, and we know that that's a challenge. So this is, maybe I'll just leave this up. This is also in the paper, right? But these are essentially what we ended up using. You'll see there's other measures that I don't have in here right now that we tried to use, but we get deed information for really rural places, which when you're interested in rural development is not particularly helpful. So.
Great. Well, how about we open it up to a conversation?
I have a clarification question. So you're going to end up using this variable share of farmers accessing direct-to-consumer markets.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand on what that is?
So
share as well as direct-to-consumer markets.
So it's just of the total number of producers, which would be farmers and ranchers in a county, what percentage of them are selling through direct markets?
What's a direct market?
So a direct market is a sale at a farmer's market. It's a sale at roadside stand, freezer beef, right? That they're reporting this information through the Census of Agriculture. Now the reason that we did that, so this is sort of separate, right? When I actually wrote this paper initially, all I did was include the information on the measures of these stocks, right? I wanted to come up with some kind of database that essentially we could put online and have available so that people who are interested in empirically analyzing the impacts of these different kinds of rural development policies could use. But then when I got sort of sunk my teeth into it more and talking with collaborators, we realized that if we want to especially send this to a good journal, we're going to need to at least do some kind of empirical testing using these measures. And so that's why what we tried to do is take a rural development policy, right? There's a lot of funding that's going to support these direct markets. And pretty clearly what they're trying to do is promote the number of farms that are selling through direct markets. So it was a way that we could fairly quickly and easily test this.
So let me just stay with a minute, just in terms of measurements. So I'm actually from a very rural county in Alabama originally. So I grow peaches and I export them to larger markets. I have my own stand. I also sell to local people, probably not a farmer's market. I don't quite know what that is yet. So where do I fit in your data?
So you're part of the dependent variable.
So is it the percentage of my...
Nope, all it is right now, and we've actually tested this with a number of other measures, and I could talk for a while about all the data that is available that we could use in this space, because that's what a lot of my other research is on. But no, all you would be is we're looking at the share of farmers in your county who have any direct sales.
So really you're eliminating anybody that sells to large producers.
We aren't eliminating them. They're just, right? We're looking at the share.
The data is eliminating what type of farmer?
Well, it's not eliminating them. All it's saying is that of the total farm, no, all of it's included in the data. All we're saying is that on a per county basis, these are the percentage of producers who are selling through these markets.
I understand that, but I'm saying, so I'm a farmer that doesn't show up in the numerator. So I'm only selling to.
But you do, because it's a share. That's what I'm confused about.
It's the denominator.
Right.
He's asking what is the definition of someone who does not sell direct?
Exactly.
Right, so it's anybody that does not check that box on the Census of Agriculture, which means that they don't have sales through roadside stands, through farmers markets, through freezer beef.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Bob Crafter. I teach in the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. There's a lot of trees here, and I'm trying to get a sense of the forest before I drill down a little bit more. And I'm also trying to get a sense of what the intertemporal dynamic might be. And I know you probably didn't look at that explicitly, but I'm just thinking about the way that capital investments are made. You could waste capital. Hernando de Soto has a kind of a distinction between assets and capital. An asset is something that's useful to you. Capital is an asset that has the ability to reproduce itself, and that's a function of sort of norms and values in the legal regime and all of those things, as well as the presence of markets within which you might be able to lever that asset to create additional value. So I'm thinking about your bathtub, and I'm looking at income coming in and expense going out, with wealth rising or falling depending upon the rate at which income and wealth flow. But isn't it possible that you could be investing in things that have low returns systematically over time, so that in fact your income flow could increase but your wealth could decrease because the value added is not very high? And what got me on this is I was thinking back to the Cambridge capital controversies of the 1950s and 60s, where you had Joan Robinson and people like Luigi Passanetti, Gregory Hopworth pitted against Robert Solow and Paul Samuelson in just talking about this, refusing, the Cambridge people refusing to take K or capital as an absolute given, saying that there's actually more of a relationship between them. I know it's probably a little unfair since you didn't look at this explicitly, but I'm just thinking about policy implications. If you're going to ask people to invest in sort of a broad array of different kinds of capitals, which ones have the highest return?
Oh, that's a really good question. And of course, there is literature, right, that looks at those. What I would say, well, let me say two things. One is that I think financial capital, and Tom Johnson in that book did a really nice job talking about this, I just touched on it briefly in here, is that financial capital, right, is only really useful in the extent that you're using it to invest in another capital that's going to generate returns. So if financial capital becomes this really interesting piece. But then the, oh God, I just forgot the other thing I was going to say. We're talking about, but you could have, maybe, I can't remember if this is exactly it, but so something like social capital, right? Social capital could be a flow, but it can also be a stock, right? And there's different ways we can actually measure that. Well, some capitals, when you use them, they become depleted, whereas other capitals, you invest them and they just continue to grow, right? Like, so social capital is a really good example. If I become friends with somebody, we start to build trust and we build a relationship, that doesn't mean I have less social cap, right? I mean, I'm just continuing to deplete it. So we have to look at all of these capitals in distinct kind of ways. But I think I had another response to your, we didn't look at temporal. Can't think of what other thing I was going to say. I'm sorry about that.
As I said, it's probably a little bit unfair, but I was thinking about that when you put your bathtub up on the slide.
Yeah, but I wish, do you remember what the last thing was you said? Because I had something very pertinent to this that I can't remember.
Not taking K for granted, but understanding that it's very possible to increase, you might even increase your income flow, but in a way that would not permit you to grow your wealth base as rapidly.
Right, absolutely. Oh.
Or just the opposite, if you, and a major expense for many, for many firms, especially consumer goods and agribusiness firms, is advertising. If you cut your advertising, then in the short run your wealth increases, but you cut your long run throat because nobody's buying your product after 30 or 90 days or something.
Right.
So they're actually not independent of one.
Yeah, no, and I don't think we are. I mean, that's just sort of a silly diagram. I don't think we're thinking that they're independent of one another. But I was going to say that I actually think probably, because your last question was about which of the capitals are most important, right? That was the end of your question. And I think it's really what we're starting to see, and I didn't include all the results from some of the interactions work we've been doing. My hypothesis is that what actually matters in terms of investment is based on what kinds of thresholds of levels of stocks you have in these capitals. And then what we have to do, especially like if you look at Europe, right, that's moved to this leader program, which is much more of a sort of bottom-up approach to rural development than what we have in this country. And I think what you have to think about is really doing some digging into what levels of social capital or what levels of human capital do we have. And once you probably are above some kind of threshold level and there's a certain level of interaction, you're able to have these kinds of outcomes. And I think that's also what we tried to do with the marginal effects in this paper, is that you can show that, right, really where we have this, because where based on where the inflection point is, right, for the, at least based on what our dependent variable is, which you could argue is maybe not the outcome you want to see, but that is certainly an outcome of a policy we have, that that your investment needs to be based, the ability to achieve your goal needs to be based on understanding what the level is of these different capitals that pre-exist in this community. Does that make sense? Okay.
So we have another one. I like the silly diagram. I took econ in the 10th grade. That was the last time. So this is helpful for me. Angela.
Yeah, I think I have a couple questions. Why was it that you decided to combine the political and social capitals, and are there any like trade-offs in that aggregation that you see? And have you considered like representation of the populace as a metric there, like percentage of female or people of color in the legislature versus the populace they're represented?
Mm-hmm. So we do have a percentage of non-white population in cultural capital. What we did for political and social is that there is some research that's been done by Stefan Getz and Anil, I'm going to butcher his last name, but it's Rangarajan, I'm saying his name wrong. He's at ERS, at Economic Research Service. And they have this paper that was published in 2006, and it's got over 400 citations. And it's using this index. So essentially, we followed their approach. So they call it social capital, but when we actually looked at the data, I think it's social and political capital, which is why I gave it both those labels. So because this had been used and had been found to be significant in so many communities, right, where they've done, people have used this, all of the data is is readily available on their website. They're part of the Northeast Center for Rural Development. So people just download the data, they continue to update it, and so that's why we use that. We wanted to try to use pre-existing measures that had sort of been vetted by the literature as much as possible. So I'm not going to argue that this is the best or most fully encompassing, but it's what they had used and had been cited a lot. So does that answer the question? But I was going to say one more thing. The other interesting thing is that when we did the principal component analysis, which I thought was interesting, is that you see that the two components really split out nicely between the two principal components that we retained, split out really nicely into essentially like social participation and political participation. So we end up sort of capturing those two. And we've done the different regression analysis in very different ways and tried to do a lot of robustness checks, which I don't fully have in here yet. But we've done it where instead of having that all capitals measure, which you see is what I've presented you those results, where we've actually retained both those principal components and then used them in the analysis to see if that makes any difference. It doesn't really seem to make a big difference.
Lee, were you next?
I can be. I didn't have, wasn't on this point, but.
Maybe you're shooing a fly or something.
No, I've got a bunch of things.
He's going to kick me out.
So, one thing I worry a little bit about your aggregation up to the national level because these regional areas are so different.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about West, we think about scarcity of water, and actually one of the biggest resources most of these folks have is prior appropriation water rights. So, how are we measuring what may be their biggest wealth is water? And we've got water markets in some places like Colorado. They're not all that well developed. But as soon as you have water markets, you're also fallowing some land, you're taking out of production, that area is going to be losing population, and people are just shipping water to urban areas. Is that a good or a bad thing? I mean, it is what it is. But I think some of your things you're almost, so that's why I think regional would be good. Sometimes you're capturing just simply age distribution. So percent of owner-occupied housing without a mortgage. That's completely reflective of the age distribution. Voter turnout, heavily skewed by age distribution, which I think having a bunch of old folks in the community is not very healthy. So you're capturing some of these things that look good, but I don't know if it's really capturing what you want. So if we get a school-age population relative to others or fertility rates, I'm just thinking about other healthy things for rural areas, and what you may be measuring for some of these things seem to me to be more reflective of age. But I think sometimes if you just just disaggregate by regions.
Yeah.
So, and where water's scarce and where it's not, and where farmland's good and where it's not, you can do that quickly with a few regions.
So a couple thoughts on this. So when we do the regression analysis, we do have state level fixed effects to try to control for some things. But I agree with what you're saying is that you could have stocks of different things in different places that are different, right? Like when I was in New York, we worry about flooding, whereas in Colorado, we don't have water, right? So
no, I mean, fixed effects gets at it partially, but it just covers up a lot of sins, in my view. So think of the econometrics at this stage as a diagnostic tool for helping us understand this before we go into kind of testing and controlling for state or regional fixed effects and so on.
So the other thing I was going to say, and if anyone has thoughts on this, finding stock measures for financial capital is incredibly difficult because they're almost all flow measures. And so this was sort of the best we could do. Now keep in mind when we do the principal component analysis, that percenter of owner-occupied housing doesn't show up.
Right.
So it doesn't seem to, we essentially don't use it, right, in the econometric analysis. But we could, there could be separate, you could come up with separate types of indicators in different regions. But maybe, especially because if the goal then is essentially to take this measures of stock and use it as a tool to think about rural development policy at the federal level, at least right now that isn't really how our federal policy is working.
No, that's good.
Although
so
leader
I've got some other
does,
things
so.
That we can talk about maybe later.
In the back.
We've got a bunch of people on the queue, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, not me. I was just shaking.
Okay. I don't want to lose anybody. I don't want to
Jay,
miss
you had
any-
agreement with everything I'm saying. Thank you.
I have backup questions. Dan?
I'll start in. One of the problems. Well, can you talk to me a little bit about the SAM, about the actual matrix itself? Oftentimes, and maybe this isn't the case in this particular case, but oftentimes, social accounting matrices, the actual A matrix itself. Oftentimes you have to struggle a bit to prove that it's productive. Has that been done with this particular matrix that you're using?
So we aren't using it at all in this. The reason I presented it here today in the preamble is that I wanted you to understand how we got to this point of trying to come up with some measures of stock so we could come up with some kind of understanding of what the level of stocks are that exist. So for example, when I was trying to think about initially, when we've done a bunch of work trying to at least add in intellectual capital into a social accounting matrix using a Northeast region only model. And so when I tried to do that, what I couldn't do, because essentially I need numbers in there, right? Although there are some papers that don't use numbers and they are able to use them, but we can leave that aside for right now. So we try to put numbers in there, and I had no idea what they should add up to, right? I had no way to know what the amount of the stock of intellectual capital was in a particular region. So this exercise was an attempt to figure out what is the existing level of the stock of these different capitals. How would you actually measure what that looks like, or get it into a quantitative sense so that then you could think about the next step about the social accounting matrix. Now, I've done a lot of research previously where I've done work augmenting social accounting matrix models based on real data, and I will be the first one to tell you that there are a lot of problems with in-plan data, but regardless, I don't think that necessarily doesn't impact this paper, and I don't think it impacts what motivates this question, which is that but countries are using systems of national accounts. And if that's what they're using, the question is, can we work within the existing system, as the Nordhaus and that National Academies panel suggested, to think about how we would augment it with these satellite accounts or with more of a comprehensive wealth accounting framework to at least be a little bit more realistic and inclusive about what actually contributes to sustainable development. that makes sense.
Why did you use PCA and not build a formal model and simply did the formal?
Well, we used principal component analysis here because we wanted to figure out what of the variables were describing the most variability, right? The most within each of the counties. So we thought that that was a good form. It also is exactly the method that Stefan Getz and Anil used in their paper, that 2006 paper that I mentioned, that's the social capital.
That does not necessarily make it a good methodology.
It's in a peer-reviewed journal article, and we followed it. So, but that's why we did it.
Other questions? Can I interject one? So I'm curious in your natural capital section in the explanation on 2 points. When I refer to easement, I'm usually talking about private lands that have been permanently protected. So I just want to clarify what you all mean by easement. You said easement divided by the total acres in the county is one of your variables. Is that?
We used the the conservation easement database,
Yeah.
right? Which we know is imperfect because I think it doesn't have complete conservation easement, but we thought that would be a good way to use. Oh, and that just reminded me one other thing I meant to say, which is that in terms of the water piece specifically, because in my hallway being my department, but we're literally in a hallway, we have a lot of resource economists and a bunch of water experts. And so I went and talked to them about what kinds of measures might actually make sense to use, and they basically told me every measure I was thinking of was a really bad measure. And so that's why we used the natural amenities index, because we felt like that was at least the best proxy that would capture some of those differences that are important across regions, for better or worse.
And my second question comes down, I mean, you obviously have a litany of projects and programs and, you know, Forest Service lands and what have you. And so I only asked this because of making a mistake recently on a survey, national survey, where we assumed trees were ubiquitous across the U.S. and our friends in the desert regions of the Southwest said, hey, not a great indicator of what's going on out here. And so when I look at these, I see a lot like wetland reserve, wetland bank reserve. There's obviously U.S. Forest Service. So I wonder if potentially on down the road adding things like military bases. Because here in this part of Indiana we have Crane and we have Atterbury, which are massive military bases that have a lot of federal lands. Most of it's forested. Mm-hmm. If that would be helpful. Or are there other types of installations that we capture, like Nevada lands, that might not be as common in these? Maybe they are. I'm just not familiar with the West. So thinking about the sort of the more arid areas.
So tell me if I'm wrong, but if you had a military base, it would be on federally owned land.
Yes.
So,
but we also have state forests too.
So we have two different measures in here, and I just don't want to say the wrong thing.
Them.
So
I was just looking at this one paragraph here.
So we have, right. So the National Forest Service acreage. Well, let me look into that. I mean, one of the things that I think this does, because there's a huge debate in the literature about the appropriate level of analysis here, right? If the county is the right level, right? In fact, I don't know if anyone saw, I think it was David Brooks that has an article in his column in the New York Times from the other day that talks about really you have to look at the community level and why the community level is so important in terms of, I think he was talking about human capital. I don't know if anyone saw that. It was like within the last week. So there's challenges. I mean, there's a huge debate in this literature. I think I tried to put a footnote in there on it. But I think that what you're going to see, and this goes to the other point too, is that you're going to see variation, right? In some places, a certain stock of a certain capital is going to be negatively associated with some kind of outcome, whereas in some places it may be positive, right? In some places it may be significant, some places not significant. And I think that's exactly the point, is that if all we're doing is looking at, okay, we're going to have policies that are going to say, you have high levels of unemployment, so we're going to try to target you, right? And we have these sort of policies that we have at the federal level, you're sort of missing the point of what you have to be looking at within these communities to really understand what's going on. So I'm not saying we're not missing something, but I think we will capture the fact that there's going to be, that not all of these stocks will impact communities in the same way in different places.
But through the math, by doing it at such a broad scale, then you sort of capture that variation.
That would be the goal, but that's not to say we're not missing variables, and I would really welcome those. And as the other thing is that we tried to do these variables as much as possible, not based on what we thought, but what was in the literature, in this interdisciplinary literature.
Yeah.
So we really purposely, like, you know, we've spent hours, right, and that's an underestimate of sitting around talking about these different variables. But ultimately, we decided that if we couldn't find peer-reviewed literature to say this was an important measure, we didn't include it.
Gotcha.
I have two questions. So first of all, this was a really interesting paper for me to read. My name is Sarah Bowerly-Dansman. I'm an assistant professor in international studies, and I'm a political scientist. So some of what's going on here I'm not as familiar with. And so I have two questions. One is about the principle component analysis as well, because if I understand correctly, what you're trying to do is you're trying to give policymakers tools to target policy better. And I'm a little bit confused why you would use PCI here, because to me it seems like it kind of confuses what specific components are actually, like, if you actually want to change what a community's score is on, you know, a social capital indicator. Like, you do through PCA, you know what different variables are loading on to that score, but it still is kind of obfuscating. It's not the same as just saying, okay, we're going to put in here kind of educational attainment and see what happens, right? So from a policymaker's perspective, I'm a little bit confused as to what exactly you would then do using this information. So I'd really like to hear more about that. And then the second question I have has to do with your measures, because, you know, reading this, I was struck by how much work this has been for you to kind of come up with all of these different measures, and whenever you present this, you're going to get someone and multiple people disagreeing with you about what measures go in here, and, you know, I'm sure that that's really frustrating.
Don't worry, we'll have military bases. No, I'm just kidding.
But that, you know, but we all have different, you know, we're all going to go to different places here. So, you know, I was thinking about things like, you know, with the, like, highways, well, it doesn't just matter how many highways you have, but how well they're maintained, right? And so, like, potholes are, like, something that you might want to measure. And when it comes to human capital, you know, it might not just be educational attainment at high levels, but, you know, how many schools per capita do you have in, especially in rural communities where schools are being, you know, taken out of rural communities and things like that. And so I understand why you might just go to the literature and just say, we're only going to put in variables here that, you know, have been shown in peer-reviewed research to matter. And maybe this is a little bit of the political scientist speaking at me, but my thought is, why don't you go to these communities and ask them what they think creates different types of wealth in their community, right? And that's taking a step back, and, you know, maybe you're not there in the life cycle of this project, but if I were doing this, I would want to go and talk to people and see what should we be measuring, and not just the academics, but the people who live here, live in those places, that are in the best kind of position to tell you, like, this is where kind of intangible or unmeasured wealth is in our community, whereas us as researchers and as scientists, you know, away from these places might not recognize that these are sources of wealth.
So both good points. So I'm going to start with the second one because it's in my brain right this second. That is pretty much what the literature is from, like, if you look at the Flores work and the sort of people who have emanated from the Flores work, and I'm guessing most people know the Flores, right, but they've been in Iowa, actually now they're somewhere else, I think, but so it's a lot of it is based on these specific case studies that are really focused in particular areas, evaluating one of the capitals and trying to understand that. So we are capturing some of that in the sense that that's in the peer-reviewed literature. Also, the Yellowwood Associates, which is one of the databases that we looked at here that they created. Yellowwood Associates ran the Ford Foundation's Rural Livelihoods program for a bunch of years, and so that's exactly what they were doing. They were working in depth in particular communities, trying to sort of figure out, like, endogenous development strategies. So we do have those pieces captured. Ultimately, I agree. I think it's really important, right, to go and talk to communities, and I I don't want to minimize that at all. But if we are trying to move forward in a way that we can impact federal policy in how we actually are evaluating these things, our goal with this particular project was to create a database from secondary data sources that are likely to be around in the future, using the best available information we have about what should be included in there. We want to put this on a website so that people can download the database for free, and then they can do their own research. And we think that then through sort of crowdsourcing this kind of information, we'll be able to continue to refine this. But there is so much work out there fighting about what measures we should use that it's counterproductive at this point, right? We need to just pick something, say this is good enough for right now. It's certainly better than what we're doing, right, with just these GDP measures and employment growth, and we can tell a better story. And part of this is, and I should have said this in the front end, although I only got 5 minutes.
Not my rule. Not my rule. Talk to him.
Is that, so I do a lot of work in local and regional food systems. And if you look at the literature that tries to evaluate the economic impacts of local food, what they do is they take these measures of direct sales and they look at the relationship between direct sales and economic growth or employment. And I think what they miss are all of these other things that actually happen, which we're starting to show that there's actually relationships. I don't know if I've fully showed it here, but some other work, that there are these things, like I mentioned with that project we have in the Northeast, that we can see that there's these impacts in intellectual capital, but they're not capturing that. And then what ends up happening then is that the research says these policies aren't working, right? Because they're not having the kind of impact on employment growth that they're supposed to have. So this is sort of a long-winded answer to say that I think at some point, and I'm not saying that this is good enough, but the goal is to get this to be good enough, just like that social capital index is sort of good enough, that we can start to do some empirical evaluation with it and see how it changes the way that we actually think about evaluating and supporting different kinds of rural development strategies. So that was the second piece. And well, let me just say the first piece, because otherwise I'll never remember it. Really showing my great short-term memory here. The principal component analysis. So we did go around and we have actually done robustness checks where instead of using the principal components, we actually retain each of the individual variables. But it gets really messy, and just remember, we're not 100% sure that we have all of the right variables in here. So that's what we tried to do with the principal component analysis, again, following what Stefan gets is to be able to tell a little bit of story about which of these indicators are sort of capturing something similar around a stock of capital, right? So where the loadings sort of capture in the same place. And so that was our thought there, but we do, when we actually go to publish this paper, we'll probably have something on the robustness checks that actually do some of these empirical analyses with all the individual variables.
Bob?
I noted what you said about not having really good financial measures.
Yeah.
So, I actually want to start by saying I think it's a very valiant attempt and you should continue to push this forward. I think this is really a very, very good start on something very special. But with respect to the financial measures, how important is it that your financial measures or your financial capital be liquid? Right. Are you really getting at financial wealth?
So
you sort of define it as assets that could readily be turned into money, but then you include non-liquid items like home equity, which is not readily convertible to cash. That would be more of a fixed asset. So if the important distinction is between built and liquid, maybe it should be included under built, but I know you have infrastructure mostly under built. So financial assets perhaps
our thinking about that last one there, and I'm not remembering specifically, but the Pender, the ERS publication that Pender was the lead author on, it has at the back this complete listing of what they think the variables are that should be included. Now, as John will readily admit now, since this is being recorded, he knows that he has measures in there that are both flows and stocks, and he said if he had to do it over again, he would try to separate those out. But our thinking was that if you have essentially, you own more of your house, then you have more ability to buy other things. And that because there's literature, right, that shows we trade off on rent and
be reflected in your liquid assets, in your cash, your marketable securities, your investment portfolio.
Right.
So, I mean, the danger here is you may be double counting. And I think the same thing may be true if you subtract out the government debt. I presume that means the local or the county government's debts.
Yeah.
That would already be capitalized in the home's value. may be a problem there. I'm all about conceptualization, so that's why I'm picking on.
No, I appreciate that.
Lee, then Jimmy.
Yeah, so I echo what Bob said. I think this is really useful, and somebody's got to do it, and you're following in Ken Arrow and Dasgupta's and guys, so it's great.
Or scary, but yeah.
It's scary.
Right.
But I think multiple measures, particularly on the dependent side, would be good.
Yes, absolutely.
So this, you're putting a lot in this, farmers market deal, and we all love farmers markets. Actually, a really nice one here in Bloomington. But think about the bad stuff too, in rural areas. That would be ultimately, at the end of the day, you want to know, which is what GDP accounting was made for, is are people happy, right? I mean, do we have stuff in these things? So GDP per capita is usually correlated with life expectancy and educational attainment and all these things. But think of opioid addiction, suicide rates. It should be just the converse of what you're finding. And when you look at some of your, your principal components here, and you're estimated, I'm looking at table 4, and here you're looking at share of farms with direct sales. How well would those things predict in a flip these other bad things?
So can I, my point here was not to do that. It was really to understand if we want to use these stocks to be able to look at a policy, a particular policy, which in this case would be like the farmers market promotion program, which I'm not trying to argue in any way is the most important policy or an even important policy. But the question is, do we have does that policy have differential impacts based on, or is it associated with differential impacts based on the stock of wealth in these different places? And what we find is yes. Yeah. And so that's what I'm really trying to get at here. So, that being said, I am really concerned that because local food is, it's not like economists' favorite topic. So most people that I know, but because of that, I'm wondering if we're kicking ourselves in the foot to try to get into a better journal by using that kind of empirical assessment. But I do think what we have to do, and we have done, I've run this already with 3 different dependent variables, with farmers markets per capita and with total direct sales per county, right? Just as kind of evaluating this in some broader ways. But we could get rid of that piece. Oh, I guess, it would be helpful for me to know, especially for those of you who have published a lot. Well, I'm getting up there, but do you think, initially we were going to just try to submit this with just sort of the front end of this paper, like stop with the principal component and then talk about a richer conversation about how this could be used, right? Really going into more of the social accounting matrix work. And maybe that's better. I think when I talked to the co-authors about it, especially if we were trying to get into more of a traditional ag econ journal, they thought that having some of the regression analysis and empirical work was going to be important so that we could show how it would be applied.
And in fact, on that, again, I'm looking at table 4. I think right now this feels still kind of sterile. Mm-hmm. So are there things that surprise you here? Some of them kind of surprised me. So again, the problem with principal component is you just throw you throw things in and out depending upon their statistical oomph. And that's okay as a good first cut. But then we get some kind of puzzling things, and you get after that, you go into that later when you talk about these inflection points and turnarounds. So it'd be useful even there, at least for me, to say, oh, well, what does Monroe County look like? What does Larimer County look like? What do counties look like when we have their measures? Just to give people a feel for the data and how, their favorite county would stack up. And does it some of these things fit our priors where cultural capital's coming in negative and going, well, gee, that's really strange, I wouldn't have thought that'd be the case. But then as you've got these tipping points, they can be on certain parts of that curve, and all that's good, but I don't think people got a good feel for that in reading the article.
I think that's a really good point. And in the first version, when I just did that front end piece with the stocks, we had made maps then of essentially the index of the stock of each of the capitals by county, to try to show the variation. Because I think one of the important points here, still when we talk about rural development policy, we really largely ignore the heterogeneity of rural, right? Or we do it based on rural-urban continuum codes, right? And we target certain policies for places that have less than X number of people. But so it's based on sort of the scale of these places rather than the fact that these places, even at the same scale, are very different and they have different comparative advantages, and we just don't take that into account. And that's really what I think this paper could start to get at. I think you're right. If I provide some more of that color commentary, that may help to talk about that in a meaningful way.
Jimmy, then Julia.
So actually, I think my point follows directly on this point. So some of the things you just said would be very good to have at the beginning of this paper. Why this measure? Why not other measures? If you're looking at rural development can occur in a lot of different ways. And you're saying, how might it apply to this specific variable? And without saying that, then the readers, you've got to play the devil's advocate as you think about sending this out for publication. And what are people going to think, or what are they going to understand? But I also want to come back to this. So basically, you've got to create, I think, a story about why, if you're going to stay with this variable, I think you've got two things to overcome. Why is it interesting, and what's the quality of the measurement? Is it capturing what you want it to be capturing? I started thinking, like, if I was a farmer, would I have some reason not to check this box? And is it costly to me not to check it? Do I gain something by checking it? And that sort of thing. Which really comes back to, I had this early on reading this, same question Lee had earlier, is I want to know something about what this variable looks like across regions and why they may differ. So you got to first convince somebody that it's an interesting variable, and the second is maybe it's more interesting in some areas than other areas.
And I really, part of it is because we're hoping to send this to the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, which the bar is pretty high if anyone's tried to send previously. And we didn't want this to be a local foods paper, right? And so, if you look at sort of the paragraph that I have in here about why food systems are interesting, tried really hard I've thought a lot before writing that piece about why we care about food systems, and to talk about that dependent variable just as a proxy for one of these policy outcomes, right? Because it's one example of a policy. So I'm really torn between I don't want this to be a food systems paper, and that's almost why I'm sort of thinking maybe we just trash this dependent variable and go with something that's a little bit more of broader interest, even though this is why we got into this paper. But
I like it. I like the variable.
But you understand what I'm saying, right? I don't want somebody to read this right away and that's why it's really about rural development and not about local foods.
So I think if you push it hard enough that this is just one example,
right?
And again, you still got this potential for criticism about what's the quality of the variable. Fortunately, that often occurs.
Right.
And fill data in general, right?
But we do have these robustness checks that we did with those other similar, and we find basically pretty similar results. So what I just haven't added in here are what those robustness checks were and what the findings were. But these are all very helpful.
Lee has a quick follow-up on this point.
Yeah, I think Jimmy's point's spot on. So you need to tell us the robustness checks and other things. When I think about rural areas, one thing I look at is how much rural outmigration has there been? How many counties are shrinking in size? How many are losing representatives to Congress? How many, so these are the other flip side. You've got this positive side, but how correlated are they with other things that we can think of as health? And that, I think, gets at Jimmy's point. It brings people on board, and if you get the same results on everything, then hey, great, this is a good proxy.
Okay, Julia.
questions. One, I'd be curious to hear how come you use the rural-urban continuum codes over your other options for classifying rural. And then on your descriptives, I was curious about some of the means. Like some of them seem high, or like impressively high. Like voter turnout. Is this saying that the mean is 67% of voters voted?
Right.
Wow, that is so high.
On
I had no idea it
average?
was so high in rural places. Yeah.
Well, this wouldn't be
And
just for
few
rural
others.
places. This is overall.
Over a certain time span.
This is
Or
for,
like
it's in a
46 museums per 10,000 population. That's a lot of museums.
but this isn't just for rural. Now, I could present the descriptive statistics like by Rook, for example, but it's overall. I was actually surprised. The one that really got me that maybe you all recognized was the percentage of the population that has a bachelor's degree or higher. I couldn't believe how low that was. I mean, that when we were putting these together, that really surprised me.
It's like 20-some, I think.
Well, especially because, you know, we're in the business of producing.
But again, it's an age thing. age
Right, well, that's,
distribution.
so then I read more because I wanted to make sure that it was right. But the Rook question.
So this is for everywhere. The descriptors are for everywhere.
They're for everywhere. So
Okay.
what we did, and we've run this a lot of different ways, but we've split it out in a few different ways. So we took the Rooks. So, you know, there was this, I think it was a National Academies panel that was convened
Yeah.
2 years ago,
Yeah.
right? And Mark Partridge was on it, David Brown, who I worked with at Cornell. And, you know, essentially they found that they think that there are measures of rural are fine, right, for
Right.
policy. That was sort of the finding. So it seems to me that based on the literature I know anyway, that there's two main ways we could have done this. We could have either done it with Rooks, or we could have done it based on the metro micro, right? And so I think we maybe have tried it that way. We've also tried it where we've grouped together different classifications of Rooks. I don't know, I feel like the Rooks is pretty defensible in the literature, but if you don't agree, then let me know.
No, I do. We've just been playing around with whether to use Rook or whether to use Ruka in some.
What is it, Ruka?
Yeah, the commuting area.
Oh, the commuting areas.
Yeah.
What I like about Rooks, maybe you get the same thing, and I've never worked with the Rukas, is that the Rooks, like I have a student that's working on a paper. So this is another application of these stocks. We got a data set in Colorado from the Colorado Department of Agriculture that looks at where we have manufacturing locations. And so we're trying to look at if there's any relationship between the manufacturing locations and then different levels of these stocks of capital. And we're particularly interested in food manufacturing, and we look at a bunch of different kinds of food manufacturing. And so I think what's interesting is, because when we control for Rooks, you know, that's really important, because when you have, even if you have a small population, if it's urban adjacent, right, that may have a big impact. So.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you discussed before, for example, the ITC endowment of the rural areas as being relevant, or where would you capture it? And I would say why I was thinking of this. There are some areas in Europe where local producers, meaning from the rural area, they join together and they sell their products directly through some platforms to the ones who are too busy to go on the market. So it is a kind of
ITC, tell me what that is.
yes, meaning like computers or some other.
We do have broadband access as a measure in here.
Yes.
Yeah, we do have broadband.
But where do you capture it? To the
And built capital?
Europe? Oh yes.
Yeah, and the highway, just to go back to the other point too, the highway measure, this is something that ERS has come up with. It's actually, I don't think it's publicly available, they let us use it. And it doesn't capture like quality exactly, but it does a lot more than just the density of highways in a particular county. There's some other pieces that are added to it, which I can't think of right this moment.
Final question, anyone? Dr. Jablonski, thank you so much. Give a round of applause.
Job candidates, you're like, okay. Hot seat.
We usually only have 17 in a room, but Thank you. And folks, if you want to stick around, I know she's got lunch plans. You're probably starving at this point, but maybe you could talk one-on-one for a
And
moment.
thank you for all of the feedback. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do on this paper before we send it out, so I really appreciate everything you mentioned today, and going to take it back to my co-authors.
Thank you very much.
Political scientists are worried about the voter turnout meeting.
Yeah,
We just checked that. That seems really, really weird.
Are you using
It's correct for if it's Colorado. It's like almost Colorado.
Because the 2012 presidential election had historically low turnout.
So,
It was like 57.5.
Your call will be disconnected.